The floor smelled of industrial bleach and old copper, a scent that had no business lingering in the marble halls of a $50 million estate. Vincent stopped at the top of the stairs, his tailored wool coat heavy with the damp chill of a Chicago midnight. Below him, a maid was on her hands and knees scrubbing a stain. When she turned the dim chandelier, light caught the unmistakable swell of a third trimester belly. Then it caught the brutal, purple-black swelling of her shattered cheekbone. He hadn't seen her in 9 years. Not since they were kids. It was Iris. The silence in the Costa estate was expensive. It was the kind of quiet bought with reinforced steel doors, acres of private woods, and men who knew how to dispose of problems before they made a sound. Vincent hated it. He preferred the rattling radiators and screaming sirens of the South Side apartment he'd grown up in. The quiet here always felt like it was holding its breath. Tonight, the quiet was broken by a wet, rhythmic scratching. Scrape, squeak, scrape. Vincent paused on the landing, unbuttoning his overcoat. His knuckles were raw, split open from a brief, ugly disagreement an hour ago at the docks. The sting was a dull throb buried under layers of exhaustion and cheap scotch. He looked down the grand staircase into the foyer. A maid, working at 2 a.m. She was on her hands and knees in the shadows near the baseboards, a bucket of gray soapy water beside her. The harsh smell of lemon pine sol and concentrated bleach drifted up the stairs, stinging his nostrils, cutting through the lingering scent of his own cigar smoke. Vincent frowned. He paid his staff well to be invisible. They were supposed to operate like ghosts cleaning the sprawling house while he was out managing the syndicate. He started down the stairs, the heavy thud of his leather Oxfords echoing against the imported marble. "Leave it," he said. His voice was a rasp, rough like sandpaper against wood. "Go to bed." The scratching stopped instantly. The figure froze her back rigid beneath the cheap gray cotton of the uniform. She didn't turn around. She just stayed perfectly still, her shoulders hitched up toward her ears like a stray dog expecting a kick. Vincent stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom. The hallway sconces cast long, distorted shadows, but the light was bright enough for him to notice the details. The uniform was 2 sizes too big, swallowing her frame. No, not swallowing. Stretching. The fabric was pulled taut across the sides, accommodating the heavy, undeniable curve of a late-stage pregnancy. He didn't care about the staff's personal lives. He didn't know their names. The housekeeper handled the hiring. But there was something about the angle of her neck, the way a stray lock of dull brown hair curled against the sweat on her nape, that sent a strange cold needle of recognition straight into his chest. "I said leave it," Vincent repeated, his tone flatter this time. She placed the scrub brush into the bucket. The water sloshed, a heavy, dead sound. She gripped the edge of the mahogany console table to pull herself up. It was a slow, agonizing movement. He could hear her breathing shallow, wet, ragged. When she finally stood and turned around, the breath evaporated from Vincent's lungs. It wasn't a sudden dramatic gasp. It was a physical failure, a sudden hollow vacuum behind his ribs. Iris, the girl who used to split stolen oranges with him on the fire escape. The girl who had stitched up his shoulder when he was 16 and too terrified to go to a hospital. The girl he had deliberately left behind when he took his father's seat, convincing himself that distancing her was the only way to keep her clean. She wasn't clean. She was wearing a stained maid's uniform in his house, shivering. Her face was a road map of violence. The left side of her jaw was swollen, a mottled canvas of deep violet, sickly yellow, and fresh, angry red. A jagged cut split her bottom lip. Her left eye was swollen shut, the skin around it tight and shiny. Vincent didn't move. He couldn't. The violent, chaotic world he managed every single day suddenly felt very small, compressed into the 3 feet of space between them. Iris looked at him with her one good eye. It was bloodshot, exhausted, utterly devoid of the warmth he remembered. There was no recognition. Or rather, there was recognition, but it wasn't for him. She was looking at the boss, the monster who owned the house. "I apologize, Mr. Costa," she whispered. Her voice was cracked, the sound of vocal cords stretched over broken glass. "I was told to ensure the grout was pristine before the morning. I'll finish quietly." "Mr. Costa." The formality hit him harder than a crowbar to the teeth. He looked from her bruised face down to her swollen stomach, then back to the bucket of dirty water. "Who did that to you?" Vincent asked. The question didn't sound like him. It wasn't the booming authoritative bark of a Mafia don. It was a weak, hollow sound. Iris lowered her head, her chin resting near her chest, hiding the worst of the bruising. "I tripped on the ice outside the staff entrance, sir. I'm sorry if I'm unsightly. I can work the night shifts exclusively." "Don't lie to me." He stepped off the final stair. The proximity made it worse. He could smell the sour tang of old fear on her beneath the bleach. He could see the faint tremor in her knees. He reached out his instinct, completely bypassing his brain. He just wanted to touch her shoulder, to anchor her, to prove she was actually standing there. As his hand moved, Iris flinched. It was a violent, full-body flinch. She threw her hands up instinctively, curving her body to shield her stomach cowering against the expensive wallpaper. Vincent froze his hand, suspended in mid-air. He looked at his own hand. His knuckles were bruised, caked in dried blood from the fight at the docks. To her, he was just another man reaching out with violent hands. A sickening wave of nausea twisted his stomach. He slowly lowered his arm, balling his hand into a tight fist at his side. The nails bit into his palms. He welcomed the pain. It grounded him. "Iris," he breathed. Her good eye snapped up to his face. A flicker of shock cracked through her practiced subservience. She hadn't realized he knew. She thought she had slipped under the radar, just another faceless ghost cleaning his floors. "Vincent," she whispered. "It was a mistake." She immediately corrected herself. "Mr. Costa, I didn't think you'd recognize me." "How long?" he asked, ignoring her correction. His eyes dropped to her belly. She wrapped her arms around herself, pulling the oversized fabric tighter. 7 months. "Not the baby." Vincent snapped the edge of his frustration bleeding through. He forced himself to lower his voice to soften the rough edges. "How long have you been working here?" "Oh, 4 months. 4 months." She had been scrubbing his floors, breathing in his dust, carrying a child, while he sat in his study drinking $200 bourbon, oblivious. "Who hit you, Iris?" he asked again, stepping closer. He kept his hands pinned to his sides. "I know what ice does to a face. Ice doesn't leave knuckles shaped into the cheekbone." Iris's breathing quickened. She looked toward the hallway leading to the kitchen, seeking an escape route. "It's nothing. It's handled. It doesn't look handled." "Please, Vincent." She pleaded, the old name slipping out desperate and frayed. "I need this job. The medical bill, the rent. Just let me finish the floor." She dropped back to her knees. The movement was so sudden, so steeped in ingrained panic, that it broke something fundamental inside him. He didn't think. He stepped forward, grabbed her under her arms, and hauled her back to her feet. She gasped a sharp sound of pain, but he didn't let go. He held her up, feeling the terrifying fragility of her bones beneath the cheap cotton. She was all sharp angles and heavy weight, unbalanced and broken. "You're not scrubbing another floor," he said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying register. "Come with me." Vincent practically carried her up the stairs. She struggled weakly, her hands pushing against his chest, but she didn't have the leverage or the energy. "Vincent, stop. The housekeeper will see. I'll get fired." She hissed, her breath hitting his neck. "I own the housekeeper. I own the house." He growled, taking the steps 2 at a time. He pushed through the double oak doors of his private wing, a sanctuary no staff member was allowed to enter without explicit written permission. The air here was different, warm, smelling of cedar wood and expensive leather. He bypassed his study and headed straight for his private bathroom. It was massive, lined in dark slate and polished brass. He set her down on the edge of the large clawfoot tub. She immediately curled inward, her hands resting protectively on her stomach. She looked entirely out of place in the opulent room, a bruised, bleach-stained ghost sitting under warm, recessed lighting. Vincent turned his back to her, opening a mirrored cabinet. His hands were shaking. He pulled out a medical kit, a real one stocked with trauma supplies, not just Band-Aids. He grabbed a bottle of saline, a clean towel, and an ice pack. "Who?" Vincent demanded, keeping his back to her as he cracked the ice pack to activate it. "It doesn't matter," Iris said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a woman who had spent months building a wall just to survive the day. "It matters to me." "Since when?" The words were quiet, but they hit like a gunshot. Vincent stopped. He gripped the edge of the marble vanity. The porcelain basin was stark white beneath his bruised knuckles. He looked up, meeting her gaze in the mirror. "Since I left you?" he asked, his voice tight. "Since you disappeared," she corrected. "Since you told me that a girl from the neighborhood had no place in your new world. You were right, by the way." "I don't." She looked down at her hands. They were raw, the skin peeling from the chemicals. "I just needed the money." He turned around, walking over to her. He knelt on the slate floor, the fabric of his expensive suit pants pulling taut. He was at eye level with her stomach now. He held out the ice pack. Iris hesitated, then reached for it. Her fingers brushed his. Her skin was freezing. She pressed the ice to her jaw, wincing as the cold made contact with the swollen tissue. Vincent took the saline and a piece of sterile gauze. "Let me," he murmured. She stiffened, but didn't pull away. He moved slowly, deliberately, broadcasting his movements so he wouldn't startle her again. He pressed the wet gauze to the split on her lip. Up close, the bruising was even worse. The skin was tight-hot to the touch, the capillary shattered beneath the surface. "He's big," Vincent said analytically, his eyes tracing the pattern of the bruise. His voice was detached, the tone he used when inspecting a crime scene. "Right-handed. Wears a ring. Look at the secondary abrasion here." He pointed lightly near her earlobe. "A heavy ring. Gold, probably. A sovereign or a signet." Iris's breathing hitched. She tried to turn her head away, but he caught her chin with his index finger. Gently, barely touching her. "He hit you hard enough to knock you down." Vincent continued, his thumb grazing the dark circle under her good eye. "But you didn't fall on your face. The dirt on the back of your uniform tells me you fell backward. You caught yourself on your elbows." He glanced at her arms. Her sleeves were rolled up. Her elbows were scraped red. "Stop," she whispered. "Did he kick you?" Vincent asked the clinical detachment, cracking, a dark, venomous anger bleeding through. "No." "Did he touch the baby?" "No." Iris snapped, swatting his hand away. The sudden burst of energy surprised them both. She breathed heavily, her chest rising and falling. "No, he wanted the money, that's all. I didn't have it this week." Vincent rocked back on his heels. The pieces were locking together, forming a picture he desperately didn't want to see. "Rent?" he asked. Iris shook her head. She looked exhausted, the brief flare of anger dying out as quickly as it came. "A loan. From before. When I got pregnant, the father, he left. Took the savings. I needed a bridge loan to keep the apartment until I could find work. I went to a guy." Vincent's blood ran cold. The temperature in the bathroom seemed to plummet. People from their old neighborhood didn't go to banks for bridge loans. They went to the streets. They went to the loan sharks. And in this city, every single loan shark paid a percentage up the ladder. They paid him. "Who?" Vincent asked. The word was a demand, a threat. Iris closed her eyes. "You don't know him, Vincent. He's just a collector." "Give me a name, Iris. Why, so you can play the hero." She let out a dry, bitter laugh that ended in a wince as it pulled at her torn lip. "You're a businessman now. You don't have time for a neighborhood collector. And if you interfere, they'll just pass the debt to someone else. I just need to work. I can pay him off in 2 months." "You're not paying him," Vincent said, standing up. He towered over her, his shadow falling across the bathtub. "Give me the name." She looked up at him, studying his face. She saw the violent tension in his jaw, the dead, terrifying calm in his eyes. She recognized it. It was the look he used to get right before he broke a neighborhood bully's arm when they were kids. But it was colder now. Older. "Russo," she finally whispered. "They call him Paulie Russo." Vincent didn't blink. He knew Paulie. Paulie was a mid-level enforcer who ran the books on the South Side. Paulie reported to a capo named Sal, who sat at Vincent's table every Sunday for dinner. Paulie wore a thick gold signet ring. The money Iris owed. The money she was bleeding for. A fraction of it eventually made its way into the duffel bags of cash deposited into Vincent's own vault. A wave of profound, suffocating self-loathing hit Vincent so hard he actually felt dizzy. He reached out and gripped the towel rack to steady himself. He had built an empire to insulate himself from the filth of the streets, and here was Iris carrying his collateral damage on her face. He was the monster under her bed, and he didn't even know it. "I need to lie down," Iris said, her voice cutting through the thick silence. She wasn't asking for permission. Her body was simply giving out. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against her knees, the ice pack sliding down to her lap. Vincent snapped out of his dark spiral. He looked at her, realizing she was shaking. Not from fear this time, but from pure physical depletion. "Right," he said, his voice clipped. "Come on." He reached down, slipping one arm behind her back and the other under her knees. "What are you doing?" She gasped, her hands instinctively, grabbing his lapels as he lifted her off the edge of the tub. "You're not walking down 3 flights of stairs to the servants' quarters," he muttered, carrying her out of the bathroom. She was heavier than he expected, the dense, solid weight of the pregnancy shifting her center of gravity. Her head fell against his shoulder. He could smell her hair, cheap shampoo, trying to mask the scent of ammonia. Beneath that, the faint sweet smell that was uniquely hers. The scent he used to associate with summer evenings on the roof. He walked past his study and kicked open the door to the master bedroom. "Vincent, no," Iris protested weakly, struggling against his grip. "This is your room. The staff." "I told you I don't give a damn about the staff," he interrupted, walking toward the massive king-sized bed. The room was vast, swallowed in shadows, the only light coming from the moon bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He laid her down gently on the edge of the mattress. The Egyptian cotton sheets looked blindingly white against her gray, damp uniform. Iris immediately tried to sit back up. "I can't. I'm dirty. I'll ruin the sheets." Vincent put a heavy hand on her shoulder, pushing her firmly but carefully back into the pillows. "Let them be ruined." He stepped back. He needed space. He needed to think. He paced to the window, looking out over the manicured lawns rolling out toward the tree line. The rain had started again, small drops hitting the thick glass with a sound like tapping fingernails. Behind him, he heard the rustle of fabric. He turned. Iris was curled on her side, her knees pulled up as close to her chest as the baby would allow. She looked impossibly small in the center of the massive bed. "You can't touch him," Iris said into the quiet of the room. Vincent stopped pacing. "Who?" "Russo." Her voice was muffled by the pillow. "I know how this works, Vincent. I watch the news. I hear the other maids talking. You're not just a businessman. If you hurt him, it causes a problem for you. A war, or whatever it is you people call it. She wasn't wrong. Paulie Russo was a made man. You couldn't just crack a made man's skull open because he roughed up a maid who owed him money. There were rules, protocols. If Vincent went after him without a sanctioned sit-down, it would look erratic. Sal would demand blood in return. It would fracture the fragile peace he had spent 4 years building. "I manage my problems," Vincent said, staring at the rain. "I am not your problem," she fired back. She pushed herself up on one elbow, wincing as her face shifted. "Don't do this, Vincent. Don't act like you care now. You made your choice 9 years ago. Let me sleep, and tomorrow I'll go back to the floors. It's safe here. Russo won't come to this house." The bitter truth in her words stung. It was safe here because Russo knew who owned the house. Russo knew not to bring his dirty street business to the boss's doorstep. Vincent walked back to the bed. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, shrugging it off, and tossed it over a chair. He pulled his tie loose, yanking the silk from his collar. "You're right," he said softly, looking down at her. "I made a choice. I thought keeping you away from me kept you out of this life." He gestured vaguely to the opulent room, to the unseen violence that paid for it all. "But you're bleeding on my floor, Iris. Over money that ultimately sits in my vault." Iris stared at him, her good eye widening slightly as the implication set in. "He works for you," she breathed. "Everyone works for me," Vincent said flatly. The admission tasted like ash in his mouth. He moved to the foot of the bed and grabbed the thick duvet, pulling it up and over her shivering frame. He didn't tuck her in. He didn't know how to be gentle like that. He just dropped the heavy fabric over her. "Sleep," he commanded. "Where are you going?" she asked. There was a sudden tiny spike of panic in her voice. Despite her anger, despite the years and the betrayal, the instinctual fear of being left alone in the dark won out. Vincent paused at the door. He didn't look back. If he looked at her bruised face again, he was going to tear the front door off its hinges and drive straight to the south side. To make a phone call, he said. He stepped out into the hallway and closed the door with a quiet click. He stood in the silent corridor for a long time. The smell of bleach was gone, replaced by the sterile, empty scent of money and power. Vincent reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't dial Sal the capo. He didn't call a sit-down to discuss the rules of the syndicate. He scrolled to a number that didn't have a name attached to it. Just a burner line. "Yeah," a gruff voice answered on the second ring. "Find Paulie Russo." Vincent set his voice a dead, emotionless void. "Don't kill him, but make sure he can't walk, and make sure he can't use his right hand ever again. I want him breathing when I get there." He hung up. The rules be damned. He was going to burn his own house down. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway struck 4. The sound reverberated through the floorboards, a hollow rhythmic thud that settled in Vincent's molars. He walked through the kitchen entrance, letting the heavy oak door click shut behind him. His wool coat was soaked through with rain, weighing an extra 10 pounds. He didn't take it off. He stood in the center of the dark, cavernous kitchen, staring at the stainless steel prep tables. The air smelled of expensive espresso beans and stale ozone. Underneath that, closer to his own skin, was the smell of rust. Vincent looked down at his hands. His knuckles were split open again, the edges of the skin jagged and purple. A dark, tacky smear of blood, not his, stained the crisp white cuff of his dress shirt. He walked to the deep industrial sink, turned on the cold water, and thrust his hands under the stream. The water hit the stainless steel and swirled pale pink toward the drain. He grabbed a stiff, bristled vegetable brush and dug it into his skin, scrubbing the blood out of his cuticles until his own pain masked the phantom sensation of Paulie Russo's jawbone giving way beneath his fist. He hadn't felt like a boss tonight. He hadn't stood back and let his enforcers work. When they dragged Paulie into the warehouse by the docks, Vincent had stripped off his jacket, picked up a heavy iron wrench, and systematically dismantled the man's right hand. "You don't touch what's mine!" The thought had echoed in his head with every sickening crunch. But the violence hadn't brought the cold satisfaction it usually did. It just left him feeling hollow, vibrating with a paranoid energy. Vincent dried his raw hands on a dish towel and took the back stairs up to his wing. When he opened the door to the master bedroom, the heavy oppressive heat hit him instantly. It smelled of damp cotton and sour sweat. Iris was thrashing under the thick duvet. Vincent tossed his wet coat onto the floor and crossed the room in 3 long strides. He stopped at the edge of the bed. Iris was curled on her side, her knees pulled tight to her chest, but she wasn't shivering anymore. She was burning. Her face was flushed, a slick sheen of sweat coating her forehead and neck. The bruised side of her face looked even more swollen, the skin tight and glossy in the dim light. "Iris?" he said softly. She let out a low, distressed whimper, her head tossing back against the pillow. Her hand clawed blindly at the collar of her oversized uniform. "Hey," he murmured, sitting on the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned under his weight. He reached out and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. She was radiating heat. A fever. Her body was fighting the trauma, fighting whatever low-grade infection was brewing under the shattered skin of her cheek. Vincent cursed under his breath. He went to the ensuite bathroom, grabbed a clean washcloth, and soaked it in ice-cold water. When he returned, he carefully pulled the heavy duvet down to her waist. She shivered at the sudden loss of heat, but she stopped thrashing. He folded the damp cloth and pressed it gently to her forehead. Iris gasped, her good eye fluttering open. It took her a few seconds to focus. The bedroom was dark lit only by the ambient glow of the security lights outside the window. She looked at his face, then down at his hands. She saw the raw scrubbed knuckles, the torn cuticle, the faint pinkish stain on his shirt cuff that the water hadn't fully washed away. "Vincent," she rasped, her voice thick and dry. "I'm here," he said, not moving his hand from the cold cloth on her head. "What did you do?" "I took care of the debt." Iris' breathing hitched. She tried to push herself up, but the fever and the sheer weight of her exhaustion pinned her back to the mattress. I told you not to touch him. You don't understand how these people work." "I am these people, Iris." Vincent said, his voice dropping an octave heavy with a brutal honesty he rarely let surface. "I run these people. Russo won't be collecting from anyone ever again." She stared at him. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. She wasn't looking at the boy who used to share a fire escape with her. She was looking at a man who could paralyze a neighborhood enforcer and then come home to wet a washcloth for a feverish maid. "You're a monster," she whispered. There was no venom in the words, just a profound, tired sorrow. Vincent didn't flinch. He just held her gaze. "I know, but I'm the monster that keeps the other ones away from you." He moved the washcloth, wiping the sweat from her neck. As he brought his hand down, Iris shifted, and her swollen stomach brushed against his forearm. Vincent froze. Beneath the cheap fabric of the uniform, he felt a sudden sharp pressure. A kick. It was a tiny, violent flutter against his skin. Then another. He pulled his hand back, as if he had been burned. His chest tightened, a strange, suffocating pressure building behind his ribs. He stared at her stomach, then back up to her face. Iris watched him, her breathing shallow. She rested a protective hand over the spot where the baby had kicked. "He's restless," she murmured. "He hates when my heart rate goes up." Vincent stared at her hand. Her fingers were raw from the bleach, her nails chipped. "I'll call my private doctor in the morning," he said, his voice completely devoid of its usual authority. It sounded hollow. "He's discreet. He'll look at your face. He'll check the baby. I don't need your doctor, Vincent. I need to leave." "You're not leaving." "You can't keep me here," she flared, her voice cracking. "I am a maid in your house. When the staff wakes up in 3 hours, what do you think is going to happen? What happens when your associates find out you crippled a man over me? I don't give a shit what the staff thinks." Vincent snapped the sudden anger and easy refuge from the terrifying vulnerability of the moment. "And my associates will fall in line, or I'll put them in the ground next to Russo." He stood up abruptly, the mattress shifting. The violent energy was back pulsing in his jaw, making his fingers twitch. He needed a drink. He needed to hit something else. "Go to sleep, Iris," he ordered, turning his back to her. "Vincent," she called out as he reached the door. He stopped his hand on the brass knob. He didn't turn around. "You can't fix 9 years of silence by breaking a man's hand," she said softly. Vincent tightened his grips on the knob until the cold metal bit into his palm. He walked out, pulling the door shut behind him, leaving her alone in the dark. The morning sun was brutally bright. It sliced through the tall windows of the foyer, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Vincent stood by the mahogany console table, drinking his coffee black. He wore a fresh charcoal suit, perfectly tailored, the armor of a man who owned the city. The only sign of the night before was the stiff, calculated way he held his right hand to avoid bending his bruised knuckles. At exactly 7:30 a.m., Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, walked into the foyer. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the boss standing there. Bosses didn't stand in the foyer at dawn. "Mr. Costa," she stammered, smoothing the front of her immaculate uniform. "I apologize. I wasn't aware you were awake. I'll have the kitchen." "Cancel the morning cleaning for the second floor," Vincent interrupted smoothly. He took a sip of the bitter coffee. "And fire the night shift manager." Mrs. Gable blinked. "Sir, the night manager. A maid left her bucket on the stairs last night." Vincent lied, his tone conversational lethal. "It's a liability. Fire him. And the girl who is working the Foyer Iris, send her final paycheck to her address. She won't be returning." Mrs. Gable swallowed hard. "Yes, Mr. Costa. Right away." She hurried off toward the staff wing. Vincent set his coffee cup down on the table. It was done. Iris didn't work here anymore. On paper, she was a fired ghost. Before he could turn away, the heavy security intercom on the wall buzzed 3 short, sharp bursts. Vincent hit the speaker button. "Yeah." "Boss?" The voice of Tommy the gate guard came through thick with tension. "Sal is here. 3 SUVs. He's got 8 guys with him. They're asking to come up the drive." Vincent checked his watch. 7:45 a.m. Sal was early. Sal was angry. "Open the gate," Vincent said calmly. "Send Sal to the study. Tell the rest of his guys to wait in the cars. If anyone steps on the grass, shoot them in the knee." "Understood." Vincent walked slowly to his study. He left the heavy double doors open, standing behind his massive oak desk. He didn't sit. Sitting gave away leverage. 3 minutes later, Sal walked in. Sal was 60 built, like a fire hydrant, with a thick neck and eyes that looked like dead black stones. He wore an expensive camel coat that didn't quite hide the bulk of the shoulder holster beneath his suit jacket. He didn't knock. He just walked in his heavy shoes, sinking into the Persian rug, and slammed the door shut behind him. "You want to tell me what the fuck happened last night?" Sal barked, dropping all pretense of respect. Vincent picked up a silver cigar cutter from his desk and turned it over in his hands. "Good morning to you too, Sal. You want coffee?" "I don't want coffee, Vince. I want to know why my top earner on the South Side is currently in Chicago. Maid getting his hand reconstructed with titanium plates." Sal stepped closer to the desk, his face flushing red. "Russo said you did it yourself. Said you dragged him into a warehouse and beat him with a pipe. Tell me he's lying." "It was a wrench," Vincent corrected quietly. He tossed the cigar cutter onto the desk. It landed with a sharp clack. "And he's not lying." Sal stared at him, genuinely stunned. "Are you out of your mind? He's a Maid guy. You sanctioned a hit on your own crew. Over what Russo says, he didn't even know what he did." "Russo put his hands on someone under my protection," Vincent said. His voice was a flat, dead calm that chilled the room. "He crossed a line." "What protection?" Sal threw his hands up in the air. "Who a politician? A judge. We have protocols, Vince. You don't just cripple a guy without bringing it to the table." "There is no table for this." Vincent leaned forward, placing his knuckles flat against the oak desk. "The girl owes him money. The debt is cleared. Russo is out of the lending business. That's the end of the conversation." Sal's eyes narrowed. He was a veteran of the streets, an animal who could smell weakness a mile away. He looked at Vincent's rigid posture, the raw knuckles the dark circles under his eyes. A girl, Sal repeated, a slow, ugly realization dawning on his face. He let out a harsh laugh. You broke a Maid man's hand. Over a broad, some neighborhood piece of ass who got in over her head. Vincent moved so fast, Sal didn't have time to flinch. He cleared the desk in a second, his left hand shooting out to grab Sal by the throat of his camel coat. He slammed the older man back against the heavy oak door. The thud rattled the picture frames on the wall. Watch your fucking mouth, Vincent hissed, his face inches from Sal's. The smell of stale garlic and fear rolled off the capo. You breathe a word about her, you look in her direction, and I'll send you to the hospital in a bag. Do you understand me? Sal gagged his hands, coming up to grip Vincent's wrist, but he didn't fight back. He looked into Vincent's eyes and saw the absolute terrifying truth. Vincent wasn't playing the boss right now. He was playing the executioner. Vince, Sal choked out. The rules! I make the rules! Vincent snarled, shoving Sal back, letting him go. Sal stumbled, catching himself against the doorframe. He straightened his coat, coughing, his face pale. The dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted. Sal knew he couldn't win a physical fight, but he also knew Vincent had just given him a massive political weapon. You're making a mistake, boss. Sal said, his voice quiet, now dangerous. The commission won't like this. You start breaking your own guys for a woman, they're going to think you're getting soft. They're going to think you're unstable. Let them think what they want. Get out of my house. Sal gave him a long, measuring look, then opened the door. Russo's crew is going to want blood, Vince. You can't put a lid on this. He walked out, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hall. Vincent stood alone in the study, his chest heaving, his muscles coiled so tight they ached. He had just declared war on his own syndicate. He turned around to pour himself a drink, but a slight movement in the hallway caught his eye. The study door was still open. Across the foyer, standing at the top of the grand staircase, was Iris. She had managed to find a heavy wool robe, one of his, and wrapped it tightly over her uniform. Her hair was a tangled mess, her face a horrific palette of bruising, but she was standing upright. She had heard everything. The muffled shouting, the thud against the door, the confirmation that Vincent was willing to burn his own world to the ground for her. Vincent stepped out of the study, looking up at her. The vast empty space of the mansion stretched between them. Iris didn't look terrified anymore. She looked devastated. She gripped the marble banister, her knuckles white. You shouldn't have done that, she called down to him, her voice echoing in the silence. It's done, he replied, standing his ground. They're going to come for you, Vincent. He looked at her, at the swell of her stomach beneath his oversized robe, at the bruise that still mocked him. Let them. Dr. Klein smelled strongly of peppermint and rubbing alcohol. He was a small, wire-thin man with meticulous hands. The kind of doctor who didn't ask why a patient's cheekbone was pulverized. Only what gauge of needle was required to stitch the laceration beneath it. He had been on Vincent's payroll for 6 years, quietly patching up bullet holes and knife wounds in the dead of night. He looked entirely out of place standing over the massive king-sized bed, his battered leather bag open on the pristine white sheets. Vincent stood by the window, his arms crossed so tightly his biceps ached. He watched Klein gently press a gloved thumb along the ridge of Iris's jaw. Iris hissed, her hands balling into fists in her lap. She was sitting up against the headboard, swimming in Vincent's dark wool robe. Her good eye was fixed firmly on the wall above Vincent's head, refusing to look at him. Orbital bone is intact, but the zygomatic arch took a severe blunt force impact, Klein murmured, shining a pen light into her eyes to check her pupillary response. No concussion remarkably. The laceration on the lip is shallow, but the localized infection is what's driving the fever. Fix it, Vincent ordered. His voice was a low vibrating hum in the quiet room. Klein didn't look up. He pulled a small vial of antibiotics and a syringe from his bag. I'm administering a broad-spectrum cephalosporin. It's safe for the 3rd trimester. He paused, tapping the syringe to clear a tiny air bubble. But her blood pressure is dangerously high, Mr. Costa. The stress is compounding the physical trauma. If she doesn't remain strictly on bed rest, she risks preeclampsia. The baby will come early, and in this state, her body won't handle a premature labor well. Vincent's jaw tightened. He looked at Iris's stomach. The swell of it seemed to demand all the oxygen in the room. Understood. Klein administered the shot. Iris didn't even flinch at the needle. She just stared at the wall, her face a rigid mask of endurance. It was the same look she used to get when they were teenagers hiding out on the fire escape, while her father tore apart their apartment downstairs, looking for liquor money. It was the look of a girl who had learned to separate her mind from her body to survive. It made Vincent want to break something else. Klein packed his bag, snapped it shut, and gave Vincent a curt nod. Keep her hydrated. Ice on the cheek 20 minutes every hour. I'll return tomorrow to check the swelling. Vincent walked the doctor to the door, handed him a thick envelope of cash from his suit pocket, and locked the door behind him. The heavy clack of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a gunshot. When Vincent turned back around, Iris was finally looking at him. I'm a prisoner again, she stated. It wasn't a question. You're a patient, Vincent corrected, walking toward the small sitting area in the corner of the room. He poured a glass of water from a crystal pitcher and carried it to the nightstand. Drink. Iris ignored the water. Mrs. Gable came up here while you were downstairs with Sal. She brought a box. It had my sneakers in it, my coat, and my final paycheck. She told me I was terminated for leaving a bucket on the stairs. It's a cover, Vincent said flatly. He pulled up a heavy armchair and sat down beside the bed, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Sal knows about you now. If the syndicate thinks you're just a fired maid, it buys us time. It muddies the water. You lied to your own people. You lied to the woman who runs your house. Iris let out a dry, rattling breath. You're building a cage, Vincent. A very expensive, very dangerous cage. I am keeping you breathing by doing exactly what you did 9 years ago. The sudden volume of her voice startled them both. The baby kicked violently in response, and she gasped, a hand flying to the side of her stomach. She closed her eyes, riding out the sharp discomfort before glaring back at him. The fever was breaking, replaced by a raw, unfiltered anger. You make the decisions. You decide who stays, who goes, who gets hurt, who gets protected. You stripped me of my agency then, and you're doing it again. Vincent stared at his hands. The bruised split knuckles, the physical evidence of his nature. 9 years ago, I took my father's seat. You know what he was. You know how he died. A car bomb on Lower Wacker. Iris recited the old neighborhood gossip falling easily from her lips. I remember the smoke from our roof. I was 22. Vincent said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He didn't look at her. He looked at the floorboards. I had to purge his old lieutenants. I had to secure the ports. I had blood on my hands every single night for a year. If I had kept you around, if I had let you stay near me." He finally looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "They would have used you to gut me. Or worse, the blood would have gotten on you. I left you behind because I thought it was the only way to keep you clean." Iris laughed a bitter, broken sound that scraped against the silence. She gestured to her face, to the purple-black swelling, the split lip, the gray-stained uniform peeking out from under his robe. "Look at me, Vincent," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Look at what clean looks like. You didn't save me from the monsters. You just left me in the dark with them, without any protection at all." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He physically recoiled, sinking back into the armchair. He had no defense. He had built a fortress of money, violence, and power, convincing himself it was all a necessary evil to keep the filth of the world contained. But the filth had leaked. It had found her. Vincent reached out his hand, hovering over the mattress. He didn't touch her. He just left his hand there, a silent, desperate offering. "I'm here now," he said. The words tasted woefully inadequate. "I'm not leaving, and no one is getting through that door." Iris looked at his hand. She didn't take it. She just pulled the heavy wool robe tighter around her shoulders, shivering, despite the warmth of the room. "That's what I'm afraid of." By 10 p.m., the sleet hit the reinforced glass like a spray of gravel. The mansion was suffocatingly quiet. A tactical silence. Vincent had cleared out the domestic staff, leaving only his 12 highest-paid security men to patrol the grounds. He sat in his study, the room reeking of gun oil and old paper. A Glock 19 lay field-stripped on the leather mat in front of him. Click, clack. He slid the barrel into the slide and locked the spring. The mechanical certainty of the weapon was the only soothing thing left. Sal's silence was deafening. Immediate anger in their world was manageable. It was the calculating pauses that got you killed. Vincent chambered around, engaged the safety, and carried a bowl of chicken broth upstairs. Iris was awake, watching the freezing rain. The swelling on her cheek had settled into an ugly mottled canvas of green and yellow. "Eat," Vincent said, setting the tray on the nightstand. The porcelain clinked sharply against the wood. She didn't look away from the window. "I'm not hungry." "Eat the bread at least. The antibiotics will tear up an empty stomach." With a heavy, exhausted sigh, she pushed herself up on one elbow, wincing as her neck muscles pulled tight. She tore off a crust of bread, chewing it mechanically like a chore. Vincent watched her. The silence stretched thick with a decade of unspoken wreckage. "Who is the father?" he asked. The question was a violation. He knew it. But the violent, possessive instinct that had shattered Paulie Russo's hand was gnawing at the back of his skull. Iris stopped chewing. She swallowed hard. "A mechanic from the diner I worked at. He left." "You said he took the savings." He panicked. "Packed a bag during my shift. Took the emergency cash from the coffee can under the sink. $700. Vincent felt a cold, murderous calm settle over his shoulders. "Give me a name." Iris let out a dry, broken laugh. She finally looked at him. "Stop it, Vincent. Stop looking for things to hit. He's a coward, but he's gone. Breaking his legs won't put the money back, and it won't unbruise my face. It'll balance the ledger." Vincent growled, the Mafia logic deeply ingrained in his bones. "My life isn't your ledger," she snapped, dropping the bread back onto the tray. That's your problem. You think every deficit requires blood. You thought breaking Russo's hand fixed what he did to me. It didn't. I still flinch when you walk in the room. I still don't know how I'm going to buy diapers." She sank back into the pillows, her chest heaving, pale and trembling. Vincent looked at her, his throat completely tight. He had brought a gun to a knife fight, only to realize she was bleeding from a totally different wound. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, hanging his head low. "I don't know how to do this any other way," he confessed. The words scraped out of his throat. "All I have is a hammer iris. Everything looks like a nail." The room went quiet again, save for the sleet against the glass. Slowly, tentatively, Iris reached out. Her fingers, still rough from the bleach, brushed the back of his neck. Vincent froze. It wasn't a flinch. It was a bridge. "I know," she whispered. He turned his head, looking at her hand. He shifted his weight, wanting to catch her fingers to pull her against him. Then the lights went out. The brass lamp died instantly. The hum of the heating cut off. Absolute pitch-black darkness swallowed the room. A split second later, the backup generators roared to life. The room flooded with the harsh crimson glow of emergency security lighting. Downstairs, the heavy mechanical wail of the perimeter breach alarm began to scream. Vincent was on his feet before the alarm hit its second cycle. The vulnerable man vanished, replaced instantly by the boss. He pulled the Glock from his waistband, flicking the safety off in one fluid motion. Iris gasped, sitting up quickly, her hands instinctively shielding her belly. "Vincent!" "Get on the floor." He barked, his eyes scanning the red-lit hallway. He grabbed her arm, hauling her off the mattress. "Now! Behind the bed! Do not move!" "Sal!" She trembled, pressing her back against the heavy oak frame. "They cut the main line." Vincent said, his voice a dead, emotionless void. He checked the chamber. "Stay down." He stepped out into the hallway, the red light carving demonic shadows into his face. The ghosts of the South Side had finally broken down the door. The red emergency strobes pulsed in a rhythmic, sickening cadence. Downstairs, the heavy thud of a breaching ram against the reinforced oak front door traveled straight up the plaster walls and into the soles of Vincent's shoes. Thud, crack, thud. The door held. The massive bay windows in the formal dining room did not. The catastrophic crash of shattering glass echoed through the house, followed immediately by the crunch of heavy boots on hardwood. Vincent stood at the top of the grand staircase, his breathing slow and controlled. The Glock in his right hand felt heavier now. Below him, the foyer was a chaotic intersection of sweeping flashlights and shouting voices. "East wing is clear," a voice barked over the wail of the alarm. It wasn't Sal. Vincent didn't announce himself. He raised the weapon, aligned the tritium night sights with the center mass of the first shadow, stepping into the foyer, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot indoors was a physical concussion, a wave of pressure that boxed his ears and tasted like sulfur. The shadow crumpled onto the imported marble without a single sound. Chaos erupted. Gunfire chewed through the walls of the staircase, sending blinding clouds of white dust into the air. Wood splinters exploded from the banister. Vincent dropped to a crouch, pressing his shoulder against the thick structural pillar at the landing. He didn't fire blindly. Ammo was finite. He leaned out just enough to catch a muzzle flash, squeezed the trigger twice, and ducked back. "Pin him down!" Someone screamed from the dark. A bullet clipped the pillar, sending a jagged shard of stone directly into Vincent's left cheek. The air grew thick with the smell of cordite and pulverized drywall. It smelled exactly like the basement of the South Side Club where he had taken his first life a decade ago. He had spent millions building a gilded cage to escape that smell, only to invite it directly into his home. The radio on his belt hissed. "Boss!" Tommy's voice cracked through the static. "We're pinned at the gate. Cops are at least 8 minutes out." 8 minutes in a gunfight was a lifetime. "Hold your position," Vincent ordered. He fired 3 suppressive shots down into the darkness, then turned and sprinted down the hallway. He slid through the doors of the master bedroom, kicking them shut. The heavy deadbolt engaged with a solid clack, but it was just wood. It wouldn't stop a 12-gauge slug. "Vincent!" Iris cried out. She was wedged into the narrow space between the heavy oak bed frame and the wall. Her hands were clamped over her ears, her good eye wide with primal terror. The red light washed over her pale face, making the dark bruising look like rotting fruit. "I'm here," he gasped, dropping to his knees beside her. He checked his magazine. 7 rounds left. "You're okay." Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway, stopping right outside their door. Vincent shifted, positioning his body completely between Iris and the wood panels. He raised the Glock. "Vince!" Sal's voice was muffled, but rough. "It's over. Your guys outside are dead. You open this door and we can talk like men. You make me shoot off the hinges and nobody walks out." Vincent felt a cold, jagged spike of grief, but buried it instantly. There was no time to mourn. "You don't want to come through this door, Sal," Vincent called back, his tone dead. "For Christ's sake, Vince." "Over a broad," Sal yelled, his voice cracking with desperate rage. "You're burning the whole family down. Hand her over. She pays for Russo's hand, and you keep your seat. That's the deal." Iris' breath hitched. She looked at Vincent. In the crimson light, she saw the brutal mathematics working behind his eyes. Hand her over. Keep the empire. It was the choice his father would have made. Vincent looked down at Iris. He looked at the cheap, bleach-stained uniform. He looked at the swollen curve of her stomach carrying a child that wasn't his. He looked at the violent marks on her face, put there by the very world Sal was asking him to preserve. He didn't just hate the choice. He hated that Sal thought he even had to consider it. "Sal," Vincent said evenly. "Yeah, Vince, I'm listening." "Go to hell." Vincent fired twice through the door. A heavy grunt sounded on the other side, followed by a body hitting the floorboards. Instantly, the hallway erupted. Automatic fire shredded the top half of the bedroom doors. The wood splintered and disintegrated, raining jagged shards over the bed. Vincent threw himself over Iris, pressing his back against the mattress, pulling her head into his chest. The noise was apocalyptic. Drywall rained down like dirty snow. Then a sharp, white-hot line of agony ripped through Vincent's left side. It punched the air out of his lungs in a sharp hiss. He didn't scream. His body simply contracted violently around the bullet. He slumped heavily against Iris. "Vincent!" she shrieked, feeling his dead weight. Her hand scrabbled blindly against his side, coming away slick and hot. "Stay down," he choked out. He forced himself up, lifting the Glock over the edge of the bed with a trembling arm and fired blindly into the hall. Click. Empty. He dropped the gun. The shooting stopped. Through the ruined door, Vincent heard the distinct wailing siren of Chicago police cruisers. Dozens of them. The 8 minutes were up. "Cops!" someone yelled. "Sal's hit. Grab him. Let's go." Heavy boots retreated. Tires squealed on wet asphalt, and then there was nothing but the red strobes. Vincent collapsed onto the carpet. His breathing was shallow and wet. Iris scrambled over to him, pressing both hands hard over the entry wound. Tears tracked through the drywall dust on her cheeks. "Look at me," she sobbed. "Stay awake." He turned his head slowly, the pain turning his limbs to lead. A faint blood-stained smile ghosted across his lips. "I told you," he whispered. "No one gets through the door." The hospital smelled like iodine and industrial floor wax. It was a cleaner smell than bleach, but it still made Iris's stomach turn. It had been 4 days. 4 days since the police breached the Costa estate. 4 days of lawyers, silent men in dark suits, pacing the waiting room, and federal agents hovering in the periphery, hoping the Mafia boss would die so they could close a dozen open cases. Vincent didn't die. The bullet had passed through the intercostal muscle, narrowly missing his lung and grazing a rib before exiting his back. Dr. Klein's immediate field dressing, before the paramedics arrived, had kept him from bleeding out on his own ruined carpet. Iris sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside his bed. She wore a pair of gray sweatpants and a soft cotton sweater one of the nurses had bought for her. The swelling on her face had significantly reduced the purples, fading into sickly yellows and pale greens. Vincent was awake. He was pale, a nasal cannula feeding him oxygen, an IV line taped to the back of his bruised, scraped hand. He watched her. He had been watching her for an hour, without saying a word. "You're staring," Iris murmured, adjusting the blanket over her stomach. "I'm making sure you're still sitting there," Vincent replied. His voice was a raspy whisper damaged by the intubation tube they had just removed that morning. Iris looked down at her hands. "The feds want to talk to me again. They want to know why Sal's men shot up the house. They want me to testify about Russo." Vincent slowly turned his head to the window. The Chicago skyline was gray and oppressive behind the glass. "You don't talk to them. You don't say a word." "Vincent, they know everything. They know about the debt." "I took care of it," he said. He moved his right hand, ignoring the pull of the IV, and picked up a heavy manila envelope resting on the tray table. He held it out to her. Iris hesitated, then took it. She unclasped the metal fastener and pulled out the paperwork. It wasn't a hit order. It wasn't cash. It was a series of legal documents, deeds, transfers of ownership. "What is this?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "It's my resignation," Vincent said quietly. The words hung in the sterile air, heavy and absolute. "The estate is being sold. The clubs, the port contracts, the lending books. Sal survived the gunshot. My lawyers met with his captains yesterday. I ceded the entire Southside territory to him. I gave up my seat on the commission." Iris stopped breathing. She stared at the papers, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what she was holding. "You gave up everything." "Not everything," Vincent corrected, looking back at her. "I kept enough clean money, legitimate investments, offshore trusts they can't touch. We have enough." "We." The pronoun landed gently between them. "You can't just walk away from the syndicate, Vincent," she whispered, terrified, of the hope blooming in her chest. "They don't let people retire." "They do when the boss willingly hands over a $40 million empire to avoid a war," he said, shifting slightly, wincing as the stitches pulled. "Sal gets the crown. He looks like the victor. In exchange, no one looks for me. No one looks for you. That was the price of peace." He reached out, his calloused, battered hand resting on the edge of her chair. "I can't be the monster and keep you safe, Iris," he said, the raw, unpolished truth bleeding out of him. "I thought power was a shield, but it's just a magnet for bullets. I'm done. I'm out." Iris looked at him, really looked at him. The slick, untouchable aura of the Mafia Don was completely gone. He was just a man. A wounded, exhausted man who had burned down his entire life so she wouldn't have to scrub floors anymore. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand over his. His fingers were cold, but his grip was instantly firm, anchoring her. "Where do we go?" she asked. "North." Vincent said, a faint light returning to his dark eyes. "Maine? I bought a place on the coast. 6 acres, lots of trees, no marble floors." He paused, his gaze dropping to her stomach. "Good schools." Iris let out a breath that sounded like a laugh, brushing a stray tear from her good cheek. "You don't know anything about babies, Vincent." "I'll learn." He squeezed her hand. "We'll learn." 6 months later, the air off the Atlantic was freezing, carrying the sharp, clean scent of salt and pine. Vincent stood on the wraparound porch of the cedar-shingled house, leaning heavily on the wooden railing. He wore a thick wool sweater, his left side still stiff when the weather turned cold. The scar was a permanent, jagged reminder of the night he died as a boss and woke up as a man. The sliding glass door behind him opened. Iris stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing his oversized flannel shirt, her hair pulled up in a messy bun. Her face was completely healed, the bruised, hollow-eyed ghost of Chicago, replaced by a tired but deeply radiant warmth. In her arms, bundled in a ridiculous, puffy fleece snowsuit, was a sleeping baby boy. Vincent turned. The hard, violent edges of his face softened instantly. He walked over, wrapping his arms around both of them, burying his face in Iris's neck. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, the baby a warm, solid weight between them. There were no sirens here, no reinforced steel doors, just the sound of the ocean crashing against the rocks, and the quiet, steady rhythm of 3 hearts finally beating in the light. If you loved this intense emotional journey of sacrifice and redemption, don't leave without letting me know. Did Vincent make the right choice burning his empire to the ground for Iris? Drop a comment below with your thoughts on their fresh start in Maine. Hit that like button if you want to see more gritty, character-driven romance stories. Share this video with fellow drama lovers and absolutely smash that subscribe button so you never miss our next epic, heart-stopping narrative. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.